James Perloff is an author of The Shadows of Power, an expose of the private influence on American foreign policy that has sold over 100,000 copies, and two books about the evidence against Darwin's theory of evolution, including Tornado in a Junkyard. He wrote for the New American Magazine for nearly 3 decades and is a regular contributor to HenryMankar.com. His newest book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, is a comprehensive look at the satanic drive for world government. He wrote the script for Free Minds Films' new documentary, Shadowring, released last week. His website is jamesperloff.com. Shadowring provides a revisionist account of the past century and a full-scale historical overview of the world's power elite's agenda. James, Shadowring, want to go to that movie? You wrote the script for it. What do you have to say about that?
What do I have to say about it?
Yeah, it's Shadowring. Apparently you wrote the screenplay?
Yeah, Free Mind Films is well known for producing A Noble Lie, which is really the premier expose of what really took place in Oklahoma City with the Oklahoma City bombing. And they subsequently did a film on mind control called State of Mind. And they approached me a couple of years ago and asked me if I would write something that would be a basic introductory film you could show people to introduce them to the oligarchy, the powers that be, and what they've been doing to us. And so that relationship began, and the movie, as you mentioned, was released last week. We're honored to have Kevin Sorbo as our narrator. He's a pretty well-known Hollywood actor. He was the star of Hercules back in the 90s. It was the #1 most-watched show in the world at the time. I didn't know that. And he was also the star of Andromeda, which was the #1 show in syndication subsequent to that. And he won a lot of Christian fans recently by starring in a movie called God's Not Dead, small budget film that did hugely at the box office. He's a narrator. Free Mind Films is the production company. Austin Green is the director. I wrote the script. And the script is really material you'll find in my books, The Shadows of Power and Truth is a Lonely Warrior, my most recent one, which came out 2 years ago.
And that's it's Chris Emery and Austin Green at Free Mind Films?
Chris Emery's producer, Austin Green director, yeah.
Okay. I watched the movie. Thank you for sending me the clip so I could screen it. I was very impressed with not only the production quality, but the also what the substance had, and the substance of the film itself. When you started off with it, I guess that you get into the film starts off with kind of a rundown of the various false flags, and then the banker, the corporatist agenda, the control of the media, and why'd you pick it? Why was it picked in that sequence? Was there a reason for that?
Yeah, there's actually a history to this. 1988, I wrote The Shadows of Power, which is a history of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the organization that the American oligarchy uses to control our government's policy. You know, this is the Council on Foreign Relations members who sit in the cabinets of both Republican and Democratic presidents. And my newest book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, is an update, a big update to that book. It goes way beyond the Council on Foreign Relations. And I was working on the whole creation evolution debate for a while with those two books, The Case Against Darwin and Tornado and Junkyard. But 911, after I learned the truth about 911, I realized that I really needed to focus my attention on the geopolitical realm, and that the Shadows of Power needed to be updated. That led me to write The Truth is a Lonely Warrior. But that book came, Tim, the first chapters came out of a PowerPoint that I was giving for the John Birch Society and for various civic groups, Oath Keepers and so forth, an introduction. And those became the opening chapters. That PowerPoint presentation became the opening chapters of Truth is a Lonely Warrior. And that, since it had been a PowerPoint, it made me very easy to convert it into a script. In fact, I gave Free Mind Films the script in both Microsoft Word using standard screenwriting format, which I'd studied back in the 90s. But I also gave them a PowerPoint version because I wanted to give them a lot of suggested graphics. I already knew a lot of the graphics that would go with this movie. But the roundabout way of answering your question, why did I start with false flags? I start with false flags in the movie and the PowerPoints in my book, Truth is a Lonely World, with false flags, because I want to show people the pattern of events that has taken place. Every one of the major wars we've been involved with, going back to Spanish American, and you probably back further. In fact, definitely back further. But I start out with the Spanish American War, sinking of the Maine, and then we go to World War I, sinking of the Lusitania, another false flag ship deliberately sent into the path of a U-boat, loaded down with munitions to make it explode and sink very rapidly. Then Pearl Harbor, which Washington had full foreknowledge of. Then the Korean War, which was artificially created when we invited Joseph Stalin to become the trustee of North Korea, even though he'd done nothing to help win the Pacific War, except for 5 days participation after we'd already nuked Hiroshima, and Japan was suing for peace. And of course, everybody knows about Tonkin Gulf, and but we review that in the movie and in my books. And then we bring it up to the Iraq War with the non-existent weapons of mass destruction. And of course, if you wanted to, you could go into each of these Middle Eastern wars. We didn't go into the 1991 Gulf War with the phony baby incubator death stories, but there's only so much we could cover. But I wanted to show people the pattern of deception, and that every war we got into was based upon deception. And then that brings a logical question, well, why do we have this pattern? And the reason we have that pattern is because we have the same oligarchy controlling America behind the scenes. So that brings us logically to phase two, which is, who is this oligarchy? And we talk about the Council on Foreign Relations, how and why they were started in 1921, and how they've dominated presidential cabinets and the CIA and every important branch, Treasury Department and the Defense Department. And then we say, well, let's follow the money. See who's behind that. We look at the banksters at Wall Street, and we tie in the Federal Reserve and show how it's destroyed the American economy and debauched the dollar, making it lose 98% of its value since 1913, when the dollar had not lost any net value. American money had not lost any net value since the days of the Pilgrims in the 1660s. It was not until the Federal Reserve came in that we had this skyrocket in inflation. We always had some inflation during wars, like the War of 1812 and War of between the states, when the government would print money, but the prices would go back to the normal values after the wars were over. So we're covering false flags, the powers that be, the Federal Reserve, and then we get into media control and this ultimate goal of world tyranny, world government, police state. And that's about as far as we can take it, Tim, in a 2-hour movie. You know, in my book, Truth is the Lonely Warrior, I go much further. We get into Zionism, we get into vaccines, we get into chemtrails, geoengineered weather, stuff like that. But that's just too much to throw at someone who's new to this material. But again, just the time limit. There's only so much you can say in 2 hours.
Of course, and obviously the movie serves as an introduction. For those who are more into this or more informed on these matters, they're pretty familiar with the points you bring up. But for someone who's new to this, the film, not only is it visually pleasing and interesting and entertaining to watch, and also disturbing, but again, it invites the viewer to say, "Oh, that's interesting," and then pick up the heavier material on it, like your book, and then proceed from there. Because obviously, reading is a much more intense and higher level of thinking, as in terms of taking in information and processing and thinking about it. And also, you probably one probably remembers it better when they read it, either from one book or several books. And that's why that's pretty much the function that many of these documentaries serve. It's that they're a complement or an introduction to maybe getting into these things in a more serious and heavier fashion. So it's the media. So things you bring up. I'm looking at your book, "Truth is the Lonely Warrior," and you, from what I understand, is the documentary is based on the first few chapters of that book. From what you're saying.
Really, yes, it's like the first 7 chapters of the book that has almost 30 chapters and appendices.
Mm-hmm. I know you've written a lot on the Lusitania and Pearl Harbor, and those are the two world wars. Of course, the Lusitania sinking didn't directly bring America into the war, but it set the pace for the next couple of years. And of course, 2 years later, Woodrow Wilson secured a declaration from the Congress after campaigning. after the campaigning that he kept us at a peace. Less than a month into his administration, he was asking for a declaration of war from against Germany, but it was the issues of the merchant vessels and the U-boats in the Pacific that enabled America's entry into that war. Can you explain to our listeners how that was engineered?
Yes, to set the context, I should mention, by the way, that the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Lusitania just went by, so I did do quite a few shows on it, and I have on my website, jamesperloff.com, an exhaustive post on the Lusitania. But 1915, when it sunk, America was not, of course, at war yet, but the First World War was raging. It began in 1914. Archduke Ferdinand was conveniently assassinated 6 months after the Federal Reserve was created, so we already had the mechanism in place to fund the war. But the Lusitania was presented to the public as the vicious sinking of a passenger ship, which it was a passenger ship, by the Germans simply to kill women and children, when in fact the Lusitania was ferrying munitions. It had 46 tons of aluminum powder, which was an explosive that the British military used. It had over 170 tons of rifle cartridges. It had mercury fulminate, a very volatile explosive used in fuses. It had an unnumbered tons of gun cotton. I say unnumbered because it was not included on the official manifest, but it was disguised as other things like butter and cheese. And other munitions, over 50 tons of shrapnel shells. This was not told to the public. The Germans knew very well that the Lusitania was ferrying munitions. There were German dock workers in New York who would see the ship. It was making monthly trips back and forth with these munitions. But in this case, it wasn't just a matter of the Germans taking it out. It was a matter of the British Admiralty deliberately sending it into a path of a U-boat. They'd already cracked Germany's naval code, same as they did in World War II. And so every time a U-boat would surface, they would pick up the transmission and find out its destination and so forth. Now, in the case of the U-20, which sunk the Lusitania, it was out of radio range of Germany, but they knew it was there. It had sunk 2 steamers the previous day. And I'll give you a quote. This is from Patrick Beasley. He was an officer in British naval intelligence. He's the guy who used to move the pieces in the map room for Winston Churchill, who was the head of the Admiralty at that time. He said this in his book, Room 40, quote, "Nothing, absolutely nothing was done to ensure the liner's safe arrival. I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy deliberately to put the Lusitania at risk in the hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war. Such a conspiracy could not have been put into effect without Winston Churchill's express permission and approval," unquote. Patrick Beasley, British Naval Intelligence. And Tim, just to clarify what he means by nothing was done to ensure that liner's safe arrival, it was standard practice when a ship like this came in to have destroyers escort the ship to protect it from U-boats. And in this case, no U-boats were sent, even though there were 4 U-boats lying idle in Milford Haven, which was very close by to where this sinking took place.
And so once again, you have this breakdown of standard operating procedure, which is indicative of some sort of setup or inside job. Again.
That is correct.
Yeah. Of course, the context of this is at the time, America was a declared neutral power. So the fact that you had German Americans watching their government aiding the British Empire at the time was a point of distress to them, because their country, their government had declared neutrality, yet they were aiding the British in this war. And of course, Britain at the time had imposed what they called a hunger blockade on Germany, and that involved the mining of open waterways, the blockading of neutral ports to starve Germany out. So Germany responded with the submarine warfare, correct?
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Several 100,000 Germans died from that British naval blockade, which was not brought to the attention of the American people. And since their fleet, which was inferior to the Royal Navy, could never get out of the North Sea, they never did exit the North Sea during the entire course of the war. They were boxed in. Only the U-boats could get out to retaliate for the blockade. And it should be pointed out that the U-boats initially observed were called cruiser rules. These were international rules agreed upon at the Hague Convention. What they would do is, you could see them doing this and old footage. They would allow a merchant ship to disembark on lifeboats before sinking it. That was the standard practice. It was a humane practice. But the reason they stopped doing that was because Winston Churchill expressly gave orders to merchant ships. They were to fire upon U-boats, and he equipped them with armament to do that, or if they didn't have armament, to ram them, and they would be prosecuted if they didn't do so. And several U-boats were sunk as a result of this change in policy by Churchill. And so finally, having lost several U-boats, the Germans were forced to no longer surface and to warn a merchant ship, because they knew they would be attacked. And the U-boats were pretty fragile as warships, and it only took one shot from a cannon to sink one. It was a well-placed shot. So that is why they fired without warning on the Lusitania. The Lusitania was, in fact, had been refitted as an auxiliary cruiser, had an armament. There's dispute whether or not she had cannons, but there is eyewitness testimony. She did have cannon on her lowest deck where the passengers were not allowed to go. This was an auxiliary cruiser, and it was ferrying munitions which were intended to kill German soldiers on the European front. And the Germans actually took out newspaper ads and requested they put next to the Cunard sailing notices. Cunard was, of course, the company that owned the Lusitania, to warn Americans not to board her. See, Winston Churchill had hoped that by forcing the U-boats to resort to undersurface attacks, that they would mistake a American ship for British and would sink an American ship by mistake. That was his original plan. And when that failed, when the Germans didn't oblige by sinking an American ship, he went to Plan B. And Plan B was to have the Germans sink a British ship with Americans on board. And that was the case. There were almost 200 Americans on board the Lusitania.
And the argument that Americans had the right to travel on an auxiliary ship with the British Navy in time of war, in a declared war zone, and not expect to suffer or face some sort of risk or harm, would be equivalent of saying that Americans had the right to go into France and have a picnic on the Somme and not be shot at.
Very well put. That is exactly the case. And Woodrow Wilson, who was very much under the control of the banker oligarchy, tried to argue that Americans had the sovereign right to travel anywhere they wanted. But he didn't make the same allowance for the American merchantmen who wanted to go to Germany and sell cotton and other goods there. He ignored them and focused only on the Germans, and calling their treatment of British merchant vessels inhumane. But in fact, Americans could safely travel to Britain very easily just by traveling on an American ship, because the Germans were not firing on American ships. So this pretext for war was nonsense.
And of course, why this was so is because the Eastern establishment, the Anglophile Eastern establishment, controlled the Wilson administration. They're the ones that put him into power, and it was the banking houses of Wall Street that had underwritten much of the Anglo-French and Russian war effort. So they had a financial interest in seeing that Germany didn't win or Germany was defeated. So it was a very narrow interest that dragged the whole country into the war. Would you agree with that?
Yes. For example, one of Woodrow Wilson's top three financial backers for his campaign was Cleveland Dodge, and who was a munitions manufacturer. And our ambassador to England at the time this Lusitania sinking was Walter Hines Page, and he was on the private payroll of Cleveland Dodge. While ambassador, he was getting, I forget, it was either $15,000 or $25,000 a year, so he could live in what they called a, quote, proper ambassadorial style. Also, Jacob Schiff was another of the top three backers of Woodrow Wilson. Jacob Schiff, of course, a major financier behind the Russian Revolution, which was taking place, the Bolshevik Revolution taking place simultaneous to this war, which is a very multi-dimensional war, very many facets to it. But yes, the Anglo-American establishment wanted Woodrow Wilson in, and you'll notice that in his first year in office was 1913. 1913 was also the year that the Federal Reserve was created and that the income tax was instituted. Wood Wilson had pledged to Bernard Baruch, well, one of the bankers of this oligarchy, that he would endorse both an income tax and a central bank, which became known as the Federal Reserve, if elected president. He had to, like all these presidents, he had to make promises to get where he was. And another promise was to listen to advice should war break out in Europe.
I'm sure the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the passage of the income tax, and the outbreak of war a year later was just one of those coincidences we see in history, right? So.
Yes, total chance. Stuff happens, dude. Stuff just happens. That's the explanations. Stuff happens. Nobody actually plans these things.
And of course, in the course of this war, the so-called merchants of death, the munition manufacturers like DuPont and some of the steel and all that, they made a lot of money. I think you mentioned there was a report that some $6 billion, this is billion in 1917 dollars, went unaccounted for.
That's correct. The Graham Committee of Congress conducted an investigation after the war, and it took 3 years, and I believe it was a 21-volume report, and they found that $6 billion had been defrauded from the American public by the bankers and the industrialists for war munitions that were never delivered or even manufactured. We're talking about airplanes were not built. The money got diverted, and Congress handed down indictments, but they were all quashed. No banker went to jail, and there was a senator who darkly joked. They says, we should just make it a law in this country that if you're worth $100 million, you can't go to jail. That's the same thing that happens today.
Too big to fail?
Yes, too big to fail. And so that the plunder was part of it. Part of it was the restructuring of Europe and the creation of the League of Nations, which was the first official world government. And part of it was creating the Bolshevik Revolution, and part of it was suppressing civil liberties through the Espionage Act and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918, suppressing free speech. Anyone who spoke out against the war was in major trouble with 10 to 20-year jail sentences. And of course, part of it was also the Balfour Declaration and the creating of the State of Israel. That was what England had to promise to do in return for the pledge to bring America into the war. So there's a whole a multi-dimensional panorama going on in this world war, which you might expect with a world war. It's not a world war is not fought for just one purpose. By the way, all of those motives continue. It's amazing how they continue with the Second World War, just bigger and badder.
Well, yeah, some historians have looked at it as more as a 30 years war, just with a brief pause in between. But the trauma of the war, the destruction of the war, and the institutions that were created in the aftermath of World War I led us into the 1920s. You had the 20s boom in America, the credit boom. But the credit boom in America was largely a function of the U.S. government propping up the British pound. And this set the stage for, I think, broad economic conditions, which led to the crash in '29 and the Great Depression. I've read your work and I've read others, and a lot of people seem to think it just wasn't just an accident or a cause of bad policy. It was a sort of a pump and dump scheme that was hatched by the elites. You could drive stocks up, get suckers to buy a bunch of stocks up, then when prices inevitably tumble because they have to raise interest rates, they're able to come in and buy everything on pennies on a dollar. We want to comment on that, or?
Well, I could probably let Charles Lindbergh comment on that. He said this act, this Charles Lindbergh, I'm talking about the father of the famous aviator who made the first nonstop transatlantic flight. He was a congressman. He was an outspoken opponent of the Federal Reserve, and just don't quite have the complete quote here, so let me just flip to another page.
Is that about scientific depressions or something?
Oh yes, yeah. But it's great to hear it from the horse's mouth. Okay, he said this of the Federal Reserve: this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. He's speaking before the Congress. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized. The money power overrides the legislative and executive forces of the nation. I've seen these forces exerted during the different stages of this bill, the Federal Reserve Act. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. The new law will create inflation whenever the trust wants inflation. if the trust can get a period of inflation, they figured they can unload stocks on the people at high prices during the excitement and then bring on a panic and buy them back at low prices. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed, unquote. Congressman Lindbergh, very courageous man, as was his son. And so that did happen. They were controlling, of course, the Federal Reserve, which almost doubled the discount rate in a span of 6 months during 1929, which of course pressured, and when interest rates goes up, that pressures money out of the stock market. They also heavily short sold the market through front groups, and that is talked about by Curtis Dahl in his book, FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law. He was, in fact, the son-in-law of Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was the syndicate manager for Lehman Brothers, and he was on the floor of the stock exchange on the day of the crash. He said it was definitely a setup. And they also called in loans on people who had borrowed a lot of money to buy stocks, and people had to dump the stock to repay the loans. So it's that combination of those elements that caused the crash. And they, of course, the banksters themselves, the Warburgs, the Rockefellers, the Mellons, Bernard Baruch, Paul Warburg, they'd gotten out of the market because they knew it was coming, and they've always controlled the markets, and this was no exception. But millions of small investors were wiped out. But when the dust had cleared, the stocks that had been selling for $100 a share were now down to $10 a share. So they just went in and bought up these companies at dime store prices.
And a lot of people will be skeptical that such a conspiracy could be hatched and carried out without people knowing about it. But if you establish central banks and give them the power to create money out of thin air and fiddle with interest rates, these are individuals that are taking these decisions, and these individuals don't emerge from the ether. They're people with backgrounds and connections, and I think you spell it out with Benjamin Strong, Montague Norman. They're all in on it. They all knew each other. Benjamin Strong, I think, was one of the big advocates of the Fed in the first place, and he becomes the New York Fed chairman. Right?
Yeah,
So,
he was at the Jekyll Island meeting in 1910 where the Fed was secretly planned. They had a 9-day meeting on Jekyll Island, which was exclusive retreat for the rich. The Vanderbilts and the Astors, the Rockefellers, the Morgans would go there, but the public couldn't, even though it's open to the public today. The island is off of Georgia, Jekyll Island, but they had a meeting there with the representatives of the House of Rockefeller, the House of Rothschild, and the House of J.P. Morgan, and they hammered out the legislation. It was really based on what the Bank of England and the other Rothschild European central banks had been doing. And then they had Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was actually the maternal grandfather of David Rockefeller, a longtime CFR chairman. He introduced it in Congress, and they wouldn't pass that bill. There was suspicion because of his well-known connections to the Rockefellers, but another bill, the Glass-Owen Act, which is very similar, was then pushed through later and signed by President Wilson. And so when you see that President Wilson, then Paul Warburg had run the Jekyll Island meeting. He was there representing the Rothschild interests. He made him vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, the very first vice chairman. And as you said, Benjamin Strong, head of the New York Fed, who had also been at Jekyll Island. So the very guys who created the Fed were put in charge of it. And again, a case of the foxes being in charge of the henhouse.
and Paul Warburg's brother, Max, was the head of the German central bank.
I can't recall if he was. I know he's head of German intelligence during the First World War, and I believe, he was also part of the. I don't think that Germany actually had a legation to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, but Paul Warburg was also appointed by President Wilson to head the American delegation to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, which created the League of Nations. Oh, yeah. So how good does it get when you're heading to both the Federal Reserve and the delegation to the Paris Peace Conference? You can see that it's the same insiders again and again. And of course, he brought Bernard Baruch there as his top financial advisor. And Wilson didn't bring a single member of the Democratic Party, not one congressman or senator accompanying him to Paris. It's just a banker show all the way through.
And Baruch, I believe, along with Brandeis, was very influential in getting U.S. into the war, largely because they were trying to, I guess, fulfill the Balfour Declaration, correct, in regards to Palestine?
Yes, that's correct. And that is just one more dimension to this war. If you want to put it together in a simple way, their goal is world government, which would be of course, a tyranny. You'd have no checks and balances if there's no countries to offset each other. They want a single global government, which the European Union, which came out of the common market, and NAFTA is supposed to turn to the North American Union. These are all stepping stones to that ultimate goal of world government. And the League of Nations was the first step towards that. But what they intend ultimately is to have the seat of the world. Every government's got a capital, right? Like our government's capital's in Washington, and I live in Massachusetts. The capital is in Boston. So where's the capital of this world government going to be? It's going to be in Jerusalem. That has been the plan all along. And of course, the reason for that is that this whole oligarchy is very evil, very Luciferian, and Jerusalem is considered the world's most holy city, traditionally by Jews, as was where Solomon's temple was, of course, and where David reigned. And for Christians, it's where Jesus Christ was crucified. And for Muslims, it's where the Dome of the Rock was. So they want basically to have their capital there, the world's holiest city. And that's what was behind the Zionist movement. And I have to say, to the shame of the Christian church, they have been behind this, thinking that this Israel we see today, this political Israel that goes and bombs defenseless people in Gaza, is somehow a recreation of the Israel of the Old Testament, which it is not. It is a completely different phenomenon, although which is not to deny that there are Judaic believers in Israel who are genuinely faithful and so forth. But this was a political contrivance by the same people behind communism and world government, the Warburg, Rothschild, Rockefeller, Morgan nexus.
The Warburgs were agents of the Rothschilds.
Correct, yes.
And so was August Belmont.
Oh, yes, he came over here, and it's interesting, I believe it was his son-in-law was Commodore Perry, who brought the trade treaty with Japan under threat of gunboat attack in 1854. So the connections are all there. They aren't laid out in your mainstream, your high school history books or even most of your college textbooks. So this is why alternative media like your show exists, Tim, because this information, a lot of us, I didn't know myself, even when I wrote The Shadows of Power in 1988, I was working on small press books that had come out. In every epoch of history, whether the Spanish-American War, World War I, during the Spanish-American War, there was George Bronson Ray wrote a book called Fakes and Facts About Cuba, which told the alternative media side of the story. And in World War I, you had Senator Robert La Follette speaking before people, saying the Lusitania was a setup, it was carrying munitions. They tried to impeach him out of the Congress until William Jennings Bryan, who'd been the Secretary of State, who resigned in disgust under Wilson and all the machinations against war, came out and confirmed him publicly. But in every war, Pearl Harbor, there were people like Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who wrote the final secret of Pearl Harbor about Roosevelt's foreknowledge, and Captain Lawrence Safford, the head of radio naval intelligence, who said, yes, we knew about Pearl Harbor. But they always had to go to small presses, So when I do my research, I'd have to go and find these small press books, because the big publishers, the Doubleday and so forth, Simon & Schuster, they would never print this stuff because they were owned by the oligarchy. But today we've got the internet, and thanks to the internet, and we've had this acceleration of information, and we'll be able to find some of these books that I didn't know existed before and exchange knowledge in a way that was never possible before. So right now we are at a new apex of understanding what's been done to us over the past century and centuries.
Yeah, it is. It is fascinating, also overawing and intimidating, because when you learn that so much has been kept from you and you've been deceived about so many major events, it can be rather intimidating. It can be paralyzing, actually, in many respects, because then you have to realize you have to start, in many respects, you have to start all over again. But let's get back. So we're into the 20s and 30s, and the economy has crashed. You have a global depression. But you mentioned Commodore Perry's mission to Japan, and basically that pried Japan open, because prior to that, Japan was a sort of this insular, feudalistic nation wanting to be left alone. They had kicked the Jesuits out in the 1600s, but they saw these modern warships show up in Tokyo. Was it Tokyo Bay? I guess I'm assuming it was Tokyo Bay, Uh,
Can't remember.
yeah, yeah, but at the Bay there, and they're given more or less given a command from this modern Europe, American ship. And then at that point, they realized they looked across the ocean and saw what was happening to China, because China at that point was being carved up by the British and other
Hmm.
European powers. So Japan decided we better modernize, and they became an industrial nation, developed a strong navy and army on Western, as all part of the Meiji Restoration and the reforms, and they became this modernized, westernized Asian country. And for many decades, they were the cat's paw for America in Asia, America's open door policy. And just to kind of make a long story short, they got too big for their britches in the 30s, and that's when America decided to go to war against them, because the powers that be didn't like Japan saying they wanted to build a co prosperity sphere in Asia, Asia for Asians. Self-serving for the Japanese, but in that time it wasn't unique for major powers to cut out spheres of influence for themselves. We had the Monroe Doctrine, correct? I mean, so this sets this. I'm doing this sets the stage for Pearl Harbor, the intrigue of Pearl Harbor. Now, would you agree with that summation of why Japan became a modern militarist power and it came at sword's blow with the United States? Would you agree with that
Well, they
reasoning?
definitely wanted that coast prosperity
Yeah.
sphere, but one thing I would add to that is that they were very alert to what the Soviet Union was doing, which was the bankster's creation. Actually, it's even been established since Glasnost that the order to murder the Tsar and his family came from Jacob Schiff. It was not from Lenin. Even Lenin didn't have the moxie to do that on his own. But the Soviet Union was expanding rapidly under Joseph Stalin. Stalin had, of course, he in 1939 he invaded Poland himself. Same time that Germany has conflict with Poland, and invaded the Lithuanian, Estonia, and Latvia, and they were also proceeding to the east. And what a lot of people don't know is that when the Japanese sent their troops into Manchuria, it was in direct response to Stalin seizing Outer Mongolia in the northwestern Chinese province of Xinjiang, and seeing what the Soviets were doing. They were exerting what their own version of the Monroe Doctrine was, which keep the Soviets out of Asia, as well as the banksters. They had this very much in mind. And Pearl Harbor, I have to say honestly, my belief what motivated our provocation of Japan, and we certainly did provoke them. And let me just see if I can find a quote that that I want. I'm probably not gonna. I didn't know we are gonna be talking in this much detail about Pearl Harbor, but uh,
You talking about the McCollum Memorandum?
no, but the McCollum memorandum definitely laid out the plan to provoke Japan, and the main method of provocation was an all-out trade embargo, especially on oil, and no modern nation can survive without it. The concern, the immediate reason for provoking Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was Operation Barbarossa. In June of 1941, it wasn't just the Germans, it was the Finns and the Italians and the Hungarians and the Romanians and the Croats who were attacking the Soviet Union. And this set off alarms all over amongst the Illuminati, the oligarchy, because they knew that if Japan attacked from the east, that Stalin and the Soviet Union would be crushed in a vise. And that's why right after the Operation Barbarossa, you have the oil embargo being imposed upon Japan to make sure they can't engage in a war with the Soviet Union, giving them no choice but to go look to the south. There's no OPEC back then. You had to get your oil through the Dutch, the British, or the Americans, and the Dutch East Indies were rich with oil. And this was predicted by Harold Ickes in a memo to Roosevelt with an embargo on Japan. He sent this memo the day after Operation Barbarossa began, that the Japanese would turn to the south to get the oil that they would need. And I should mention, in terms of Pearl Harbor, something people need to remember is that the decision to base the fleet in Pearl Harbor was a completely ill-advised decision made entirely by President Roosevelt. Pearl Harbor was the last, really not the place to put the fleet. It was a place where the fleet would be boxed in like sardines. Pearl Harbor was surrounded by the ocean. You could be attacked from 360 degrees, which was not the case if it kept its normal berthing on the American West Coast. It also had been resupplied over 2,000 miles of Pacific. Plus, Hawaii had over 37% of its population was Japanese, meaning we'd be vulnerable to espionage and sabotage. It made no sense to put it there. So when FDR gave the order to base the fleet in Pearl Harbor, not the West Coast, J.L. Richardson, the fleet admiral, flew to Washington in a rage, and he gave Roosevelt all these sound reasons why it was not a good idea. Roosevelt's only reason he could give to Admiral Richardson was that it will deter the Japanese from aggression. And of course, as of December the 7th, 1941, everyone knew that that pretext was wrong. But Roosevelt then had Admiral Richardson fired. He was fired shortly after this meeting with Roosevelt, and no explanation was given him. He asked the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, he said it's completely without precedent for a fleet commander to be fired without an explanation. And Knox said, well, the president's promised to meet with you, but the meeting never came. And finally, Knox told him, well, the last time you were here, you made the president unhappy. And that was the only explanation he was given. He was replaced by Admiral Kimmel. Admiral Husband Kimmel became the fleet commander who trusted that Washington would keep him apprised of any intelligence pointing to attack. But in point of fact, Washington, which had full foreknowledge of that attack, I'll get to a pause here in a moment, but had full foreknowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack through three major means. Semantically, I'll divide them. One was the decoded diplomatic intercepts, which revealed we had actually translated the declaration of war before they gave it to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. We knew that they had told their consulate in Honolulu to tell Tokyo on a regular basis the exact position of each warship in dock. This information was not shared with Hawaii. But also, besides the decoded diplomatic intercepts, there were the decoded naval intercepts, which included Admiral Yamamoto's message to the First Air Fleet, November 26, 1941. I'll quote that, quote, "The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day. Exact date to be given by later order," unquote. To Admiral Yamamoto, decoded naval intercept. And then, of course, there are all the personal warnings that President Roosevelt received about the attack from Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan, from J. Edgar Hoover, based on information he got from Dusko Popov, the Yugoslavian double agent. Senator Guy Gillette had information about the attack he shared with the president. So did Martin Dies, a Texas congressman. And those Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe, who got a warning from the Dutch. He was the American military observer in Java, which the Dutch were controlling. It just goes on and on. It's sickening when you see the amount of information Washington had, and yet after the attack, who gets blamed? Of course, it's the commanders in Hawaii. Admiral Kimmel and General Walter C. Short, our Army commander in Hawaii, were made the scapegoats. And to this day, many people still believe the official propaganda about that.
Despite the fact that a Navy and Army board acquitted them, really vindicated them, I think you've written about or said that. Well, actually, you had the Owen committee, which was sort of a whitewash because he was an FDR crony.
Correct.
But you had the subsequent trial. So was it a trial or just a committee, Army and Navy hearing on the matter?
It was a Naval Court of Inquiry, the Army Pearl Harbor Board met in 1944.
And what were their findings?
They both found that Washington had full foreknowledge of the attack because at this point,
why wasn't it on the front page of the New York Times when that happened?
Because Roosevelt ordered that the findings of the Naval Court of Inquiry, the Army Pearl Harbor Board, be made confidential, that it could compromise national security. And so what he did was, so it didn't make the press. The fact that Admiral Kimmel had been completely exonerated was withheld from public knowledge. And in the meantime, he appointed new people to conduct new investigations. And under heavy pressure, officers who had testified between these two boards now reversed their testimony. Um, and actually, the head of the Army investigation was Colonel Henry Clausen. Um, I'm laughing because FDR was a 33rd degree Mason, and Henry Clausen went on after making findings to reverse the Army Pearl Harbor Board's disclosures. He was made the head of all Freemasons in America in the 1960s. So you see, if you look at the Owen Roberts Commission, every man on there was given an ambassadorship or a four-star general or some incredible reward for favorable findings to Roosevelt. So yes, there was they were exonerated, but then before the public could find out, new inquiries were done on the orders of Roosevelt, and officers were compelled with threats to change their testimony. Everybody understood what was going to happen to them if they testified, did not change their testimony. So he got the testimony changed. Basically, he fixed it.
Mm-hmm. And the matter of foreknowledge is not even in dispute anymore. I think even FDR's defenders now admit that he had to do this because America was stubbornly isolationist at this point.
Well, you can go back to 1947. George Morgenstern, who was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, wrote a book called Pearl Harbor, The Story of the Secret War, which exposed a lot that he didn't know the full story at the time, but he knew about the decoded diplomatic intercepts. And then you had Robert Theobald, who I mentioned. He wrote The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor. He was Rear Admiral. Admiral Kimmel wrote his own book called Admiral Kimmel's Story, but again, he had to go to a small press to do that. John Toland wrote a terrific book. I consider it personally the best. It's my favorite, called
Day of Infamy?
Infamy. Infamy, Pearl Harbor and its aftermath. That was 1982. They had Robert Stinnett come out with Day of Deceit in 2000, and he used the Freedom of Information Act to uncover the fact we had decoded the naval intercepts as well. That had not been known until then. And they've got another book by George Victor, The Pearl Harbor Myth, and Percy Greaves, Pearl Harbor, The Seeds and Fruits of Infamy. And even the BBC, believe it or not, had a documentary in 1988 called Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor, which exposed this. And this is actually on the History Channel, but the History Channel no longer shows that on Pearl Harbor Day. It's been tucked back, into a corner where so no one could see it. But it is on YouTube. It's viewable on YouTube, and I have a link to it from my own. I have an article, by the way, about these major wars. Articles on all of them. I have an article called on my website, jamesperloff.com. It's called Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 911. The one on the Lusitania is called False Flag at Sea. I have links to an article I wrote for the New American on the Spanish-American War called Trial Run for Interventionism. I also have an article on the Vietnam War and one on the Korean War on my website, jamesperloff.com, which goes into great detail on these wars and these false flags.
I guess it was just a failure of imagination on the part
I'm sorry?
Was it just a failure of imagination on the part of the Roosevelt administration that enabled the attack to happen? Because that was the 9/11 Commission on 9/11. That's what they said. It was a failure of imagination.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't pick up on that. Pick on that. Well, weren't imaginative enough in figuring what the Japanese would do. In other words,
just
like that. That's what they probably would say. But again, even then, they didn't accuse Roosevelt of that. They accused the commanders in Hawaii of not taking proper surveillance measures, even though they only had 1/3 the number of surveillance planes they needed to keep track of the waters around Hawaii.
So now the war is fought in 1945, 1946, and you've had a number of things. You've written a lot and had a lot of things to say about Korea and Vietnam, how these were set up. I just want to add this part to before you talk about it. What's his name? The Secret Team, the book written by Fletcher Prouty. I'm sorry, Fletcher Prouty. Familiar with his work?
A little bit.
Yeah. He said, I read, and also he said a number of times when he was in Japan right after the war, that much of the munitions that had been sent to Asia for the Pacific, into the Pacific theater, that the huge amount of munitions that were sent there in anticipation of the invasion, they were divided up. Half went to Vietnam, half went to Korea. And that was there to supply the communists in the north and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam against the French. That was his claim. And that seems to be consistent with your claim regarding Korea and Vietnam, how they were set up to be a future conflict, so the national security state would have their wars. Do you want anything to say on that, and then talk about Korea and Vietnam?
Well, I hadn't read that specific remark by Fletcher Prouty, but it's very spot on. Mm-hmm. We were fighting the war in the Pacific. Stalin was not. The Soviet Union was fighting a one-front war, certainly a very tough one, against Germany and her allies on her western borders. And Roosevelt asked Stalin if he would break his non-aggression pact with Japan, and he did have a non-aggression pact with Japan, and come into the Pacific War. He asked them this at the Tehran Conference of 1943. And Stalin agreed on the condition that we supply his Far Eastern Army with everything it needed to fight the Japanese. And so we did that. We sent him 600 shiploads of Lend-Lease for the express purpose of fighting Japan. But he didn't come into the war until 5 days before it ended. And we'd already struck Hiroshima with the atomic bomb. Japan was suing for peace. There was no need to bring Stalin in. But he came in, and he was, just speaking of munitions, he was allowed to accept the huge surrendered Japanese weapons from their depots, along with the American Lend-Lease weapons. These were given to Mao Zedong for the overthrow of the nationalist government, which fell in 1949. And he was also made, the Soviet Union was allowed to become the trustee of North Korea. This was proposed actually in an article in Foreign Affairs in 1944 called Korea in the Post-War World. Foreign Affairs is the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, the hidden oligarchy's means of controlling presidential cabinets. And so even though he'd done almost zero to win the Pacific War, he was given control of North Korea. Then he armed Kim Il-sung to the teeth. He built a 150,000 man army, equipped it with MiGs and tanks. When we left South Korea in 1949, they didn't have a single tank. They didn't have a single anti-tank gun. And that was a setup for a war whose sole purpose, well, there's a couple of purposes, but the main purpose was to validate the United Nations. They created the United Nations out of World War II, and a lot of skeptics in the American Congress were saying it could never maintain peace. And they were going to show these hicks from South Dakota and Nebraska that, yes, the UN can keep the peace, and that's why this war was fought, and that's why Korea was artificially divided. And but the other reason for the war was to override the constitutional mandate that only Congress can declare war. We haven't had a declaration of war since we got into the UN. Harry Truman sent troops to Korea under UN mandate. He did not bother to consult the Congress. And we've not had a declaration of war since that time. And that was the second purpose. But the overriding one was to validate the UN. In fact, see if I can get another quote here from Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, let's bring it up to April 1952. In their article, Korea in Perspective, it says, quote, "The burden of my argument based on the meaning of our experience in Korea is that we've made historic progress towards the establishment of a viable system of collective security," unquote, meaning the UN. That's what it's all about. 100,000 American casualties without a declaration of war, all to prove that the UN could keep the peace. Artificially created war. No need to have Stalin in North Korea. No need at all.
And that was despite the fact that under the terms of the United States Congress ratifying the UN treaty, it was clearly spelled out that any agreement, any within the UN, would not supersede the constitutional requirements for declaration of war. And they were just ignored by the Congress.
Yeah, and but the Constitution also says that treaty shall be the supreme law of the land, and they use that pretext to override the Constitution.
Yeah. And also, you also have Dean Acheson, who in the winter of 1950 said that Korea was outside our defense perimeter.
That's correct. And he was said it would have to rely on, I forget the exact phrase he used, but it would have to rely on international help in the form of the UN. And of course, that's exactly what happened. It was very interesting that he said that it clearly lay outside our defensive perimeter, which he did not apply to other zones.
Yeah.
Very, very clearly setting him up, and perhaps even giving Kim Il-sung some bait to go after. He says, "Oh, the U.S. is not going to intervene here."
That's like the American ambassador with Saddam Hussein. April Glaspie was her name.
Oh yes,
Yeah, very similar.
yes.
No,
Said told don't worry, we're not going to intervene, and she's been muzzled ever since. They don't want the press to speak to her about that. But that was the 1991 Gulf War, and you're absolutely right. Saddam Hussein did not want to war against Kuwait if he thought the Americans would intervene. So she said we wouldn't, and we did.
yeah,
Politicians lie.
just more of these patterns. And you, Chris, I mentioned Dean Acheson, and we're getting into Vietnam, and I think you made the point. Some of the hawks that got us into Vietnam, right wingers, right? Like Dean Acheson, Walter Rostow, these guys. These are like, right? These are John Birchites, Birchers, right?
Well, it's interesting. We talked before the show began about how I mentioned that I was a hippie back in the 60s. And yeah, we thought these guys were these right-wing, anti-communist, flag-waving hawks. We thought they were Archie Bunker, basically. The great television stereotype of what conservative right-winger was supposed to be. And but if you look at it, what we break down in the movie and in my book is that Kennedy sent the first major movement of troops, 10,000 troops to Vietnam in October of '61. And he did that on the express advice of Walt Rostow. And so people would think, well, he must be this big flag waver, when in point of fact, this CFR member, two of his aunts were members of the U.S. Communist Party. His father had been a Marxist revolutionary in Russia, and his brother, Eugene Debs Rostow, was named for the Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs. So he was no right-wing anti-communist. And as far as being patriotic goes, he'd written a book called, let's see, let me grab the quote. But he made a quote which really embodies the entire Council on Foreign Relations outlook on the world. And let me just bring that quote up. Here it goes. This is from his book, The United States in the World Arena, published 1960. This is the year before he gave Kennedy the advice to go to Vietnam. He said, quote, "It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this right is the root of national sovereignty, it is therefore in American interest to see an end to nationhood as it has been historically defined," unquote. So he's talking about an end to nationhood. And of course, that is what the Council of Foreign Relations has always been after, is a global government. That's why it was established in 1921. It was established expressly as a reaction to the U.S. Senate's rejection of our entering the League of Nations.
And you mentioned also Dean Acheson. He was a lawyer for Stalinist Russia in the 30s, correct? In the United States?
That's correct. Do you have my book?
Yes.
Oh, you do? Okay, yeah. I was wondering, I thought you'd only seen the movie. But yes, he'd been employed by Stalin to represent Soviet interests, and as an attorney, his law partner was Donald Hiss, who was a member of the Communist Party and was the brother of Alger Hiss, who was a Soviet spy. And so, but he was the leader of the Wise Men, which was unknown to the public at that time. There's a secret clique of advisors, men like John J. McCloy and Averill Harriman and Robert Levitt, who were always dictating our policy from behind the scenes. But they were leading Johnson on. They were the ones who told him to escalate the war. And the man most vocal and demanding that the war be escalated was Dean Acheson. And what really gets interesting is that his son-in-law was William P. Bundy, who wrote the Tonkin Gulf Resolution before the Tonkin Gulf incident took place. So you can see there is this tight-knit group unknown to the public. I mean, they know their names, but they don't know how they're operating behind the scenes to get us to the war. William P. Bundy had been headed up the Alger Hiss Defense Fund back in the 50s. And after the Vietnam War was over, he left the the State Department to become the editor of Foreign Affairs, the journal of the Council of Foreign Relations, and he was appointed to that position by David Rockefeller, CFR chairman. So again, you've got the same oligarchy calling the shots.
So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was written before the event supposedly occurred.
Correct. They were just waiting for a pretext. And everybody today, even the most devout neocon, I think, will admit that the Tonkin Gulf incident did not occur. You can go to YouTube and you can see the sailors from the USS Maddox, the destroyer involved that night, that acknowledged no torpedoes, no torpedo boats. And in my book, I quote Admiral James Stockdale, who's a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, who was in the Tonga Gulf, overflew it for 90 minutes. He saw absolutely no torpedo boats, no torpedoes.
So not only are people like Bundy wise, they're apparently clairvoyant.
Yeah, they can make. Yeah, they're magicians. Um, they can pull a rabbit out of the hat and make a war from nothing.
Well, I hear the CIA loves magicians, so and musicians, from what I understand. Um, okay, so basically we're here in Vietnam. Of course, that the what really led to Vietnam, again, it's multifaceted, multi-layered, many interests. A lot of, I mean, I guess you could say a lot of it was the heroin trade coming out of Asia with the Office of Strategic Services. They were muscling out the French. Then you have probably the Army wanted their land war because they had been out they had been outmaneuvered by the Air Force then for budget concerns. And you have the simple sale of helicopters and the contracts with dredging ports and things like that. But that's sort of like a mid-level interest involved in that war. Of course, none of it involved genuine national security. That's the the point of all these wars. So why are we sending our flower of our youth that could be killed over these, to kill and be killed over in Asia? Um, but what I'm getting here, and what the sense I get when you're talking about this clique of people who seem to be right-wing oligarchs, but they also tend to support communists, like the Rockefellers or Harriman. I think Harriman had the manganese rights in Russia in return for funding Stalin. Um, so there's this deal going on at a higher level that normal geopolitics doesn't explain. Do you want to get into that? I think about what's going on here. They're not communists; they're globalists, correct? This is just part of a Hegelian dialectic they're creating. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I quoted in my book Nicholas Murray Butler of the Fabian Society. He said, quote, "Communism is the instrument with which the financial world can topple governments and then erect a world government with a world police and a world money," unquote. That was a quote from 1937.
Mhm.
And the idea is, people think that the Wall Streeters are against the always been against the communists, but in fact, we could get into that. But of course, the whole Bolshevik Revolution was being funded by the Rothschilds, and it was Max Warburg who sent Lenin into Russia in a train in 1917 with millions of dollars in gold, and of course, it was Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb, which is the Rothschild satellite in New York City, who sent Trotsky in with 20 million in gold. So they were funding the revolution from the beginning. And of course, there were Zionist motives as well as world government motives involved here. But communism is revolutionary, of course, and to topple a monarch, to destroy an existing government, you need either a war or revolution. And so they've used wars to get rid of governments and restructure the world with their League of Nations and UN. And they've also used communism as a tool to destroy reigning monarchs and leaders and replace them with something else. But you see what happens is eventually the communist countries go bankrupt, and then the multinationals come in and take over.
So basically, it's sort of the Masonic idea of order out of chaos.
Yeah, bad order.
Yeah, but it's because I see what's going on. Why Russia might have been targeted at that point is Russia was outside the Anglo American sphere. For all its faults, Russia didn't have a bank that was connected to the Western central banks. And also, you're familiar with the Mackinder Doctrine, British imperial policy.
I am actually not familiar with that term, so why don't you explain it?
Halford Mackinder was a British geostrategist in the 19th century, and he came with the idea in order to control the world, you have to control Europe. And the way to control Europe is you control the center of Europe, which is Eurasia. So Russia was targeted. But looking at Russia was always too weak to confront directly militarily, but she was vulnerable to subversion. And this set up this convoluted British method, way of getting Russia to fight Germany. Because both Germany and Russia were concerned British, the British Empire, because they were both coming on like gangbusters in the latter part of the 19th century. So they had to come up with a way to get the two powers to fight with each other. and that's what they did with World War One. That's why I think maybe you were alluding to that when you talked about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, because there are some people who made the connections with some sort of Masonic order, the Black Hand in Serbia, which had connections to British Masonic orders and British intelligence. And so what happened was, as far as the Western financial interest is, what Russia also had was very wealthy. It was endowed with these huge natural resources. And this was, you're familiar with Anthony Sutton's work on that?
Um, well, I've read Wall Street and the
Yeah.
Bolshevik Revolution. Yes.
What he said, and this is, I think, at least a very good partial explanation of what was going on there. He said the whole idea of destabilizing Russia with the Bolsheviks was to create the captured markets. You take Russia out of the game, you get control of the resources, and therefore the resources you control globally are worth more. It's all about controlling the flow of these resources, the flow of oil, not so much getting it, but keeping it out of the market and controlling it. And we're seeing that today with sort of this pipeline politics in the Ukraine and in the Balkans and in the Middle East with Syria. All this conflicts, a lot of it involves the concern of the construction of various pipelines, which would maybe attach Russia, make Russia more commercially integrated with Europe, which would weaken NATO's hold on Europe. Anyway, that's the theory. I think it has some validity.
Well, there's no question that they've always had a major focus on the control of energy, because energy is what makes things work and move, and ships need them, and trucks need them, and aircraft need them. And so, yeah, along with money, the control of money and markets, energy, of course, the Rockefellers with their Standard Oil and BP, energy has always been a central part of what they knew they needed to control in order to control the world.
And these banking families, they're, of course, what they do is when they finance these wars, they finance both sides. And at the end, they're able to pick up the pieces and use the winning side to collect. And that's why you saw Standard Oil, doing brisk business with the Germans during World War II, despite the, that America was at war with Germany. The Luftwaffe was able to fly because of Standard Oil's, aviation fuel. And same with GM and Opel plants and all that stuff. Building IBM had an office at Auschwitz. So, and it could be that just these multinational corporations are just above the fray. So even when a war breaks out, they don't see themselves being. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, they absolutely, their devotion is to the international order.
Yeah.
Freemasonry is like that. At the lower levels, a Blue Lodge Mason, of course, will be enlisted into the armed forces and will fight for his country. Mm-hmm. But the upper level Masons are loyal to international Masonry. That was even true during the Revolutionary War, when General Howe, the British general, was secretly corresponding with George Washington, both of them high-ranking Freemasons.
Well, I did not know that. So I have to look into that. That's very interesting. But that's kind of gives the key how the world works, because a lot of people, when you bring Freemasonry, you bring in some of these esoteric things, it'll turn people off because it comes across as conspiratorial, weird, or esoteric, and not something they're familiar with. But it gives us an idea how some of these elites operate and how they view the world and how they relate to one another. And that's why things like like the P2 Lodge in Italy are important, because these groups are also used by intelligence agencies to operate, to kind of operate secret governments, parallel governments, and carry on in their various intelligence operations. Again, one thing, reading your work, we talk about the geopolitics, the various interests involved. But I gather you think at the end of the day, what this really is a spiritual battle.
That's right. If you look at the works of the late Ted Gunderson, who was very high in the FBI. In fact, he was special agent in charge of the Los Angeles branch, or the works of John Coleman of MI6, or the works of William Guy Carr, who was in the Canadian Intelligence Service. They all corroborate that these world elites are in fact Luciferians. They are not atheists. They are in fact Satan worshippers. They worship in secret. It's not something that they openly discuss. But and this is also backed up, by some of the footage we've seen at Bohemian
Hmm.
Grove, where they had this some say it's a mock sacrifice, some people it's a real sacrifice of a human being before this 40-foot owl. They're really into some very weird things. You can see them giving Masonic and satanic handshakes and signals and so forth. And you've got the satanic imagery in Hollywood. At the Super Bowl halftime shows, you've got Madonna dressing up as Baphomet. And some people thought that the last Super Bowl, when Katy Perry was riding this animal with his red demonic eyes, that she was supposed to be the whore of Babylon, riding the beast that's spoken of in the book of Revelation. I don't know if that was an allusion to that or not, but it wouldn't surprise me. But you can see everywhere. And of course, the Bible does say that in what it calls the end times, or the latter days of the earth, that the world will be ruled by a dictator called the Antichrist, who'll rule all the nations on earth. And of course, everybody's familiar with the passage about no one can buy or sell without the mark of the beast. What I like to always point out is that to govern the world, you need a world government. And I think it's very clear that that's what is being led up to by all of these stepping stones to world government, such as NAFTA, the proposed North American Union, NATO, the proposed, the TTIP, and the common market being converted into the European Union. All of these things are moving us in that direction of the global government that the Council on Foreign Relations has sought since its inception in 1921. That's what it's all about. It's about a tyranny. And if you look at these guys, you see how Luciferian they are, and all the wars and deceptions that they have done. That's very much the character of Satan. If you look at him in the Bible, he was a deceiver and he was a murderer. And so, if you want to throw out the Bible, though, you can see from the intelligence reports that these guys are evil and that they are after a world government. And if there's a world government, it's going to have a capital, and that capital that they're after is Jerusalem.
Hmm. You in your book, you go delve into the arts, entertainment, the importance of entertainment. Before I let you go tonight, I just want to get your thoughts on this because you've talked about um, the phenomena, the pop music phenomena, like the Beatles,
Mm-hmm.
some of these other popular bands of the '60s, and the purpose they served in this agenda. You want to go into that a little bit? I think it's very interesting.
Certainly. Yeah, you had a very fascinating guest on two interviews again. Remind me of his name again.
Jan Irvin.
Jan Irvin, and I only got halfway through the interview tonight. I was listening to it, and he was talking about this very phenomena of how the '60s were actually a psyop, the psychedelic era, and I was a hippie back then. And you also referenced Dave McGowan in that interview, but part of the purpose of the Vietnam War was, in fact, to get American kids to revolt and rebel and create this huge slide to the left. And I don't know if that was his interpretation. I didn't get all the way through the interview, but it was John Coleman of MI6 who first drew my attention to the fact that the Beatles were generated out of MI6, and that actually some of the first songs were created for them. And then I did more research and I found that the Screaming Girls, that kind of phenomena is you. The girls were hired. I mean, I remember when the Beatles came to America in 1964, and they came into the airport, and all the news media was there. People say, "Oh, they were leading the rebellion." No, there was a mainstream was supporting them, and it was like the pulpit arrived, and you had all these screaming girls, and it turns out the girls were all from one school in Brooklyn and got paid $20 a piece. They didn't. Most of them probably didn't know who the Beatles were, but this was an artificially created phenomena, and of course they swiftly were converted into the centerpiece of the whole psychedelic drug culture. But Dave McGowan made fantastic revelations showing that the same thing happened here in America. Have you interviewed him?
Yes, I have.
Oh, yes. Well, you know the whole story, how it was the Doors, Jim Morrison, was the son of Admiral George Morrison, who was the commander in the Tonkin Gulf when the Tonkin Gulf incident took place. It's amazing. The Doors came out of nowhere. They'd never been in a band before, and all of a sudden they've got this major recording contract. Now, the songs were great. I mean, some of those songs were brilliant, but the question's been raised, was some of this music created for them? And of course, it turns out that there's a lot of fakery going on with that Laurel Canyon neighborhood and the Beach Boys and all those hippie groups.
Yeah,
who had connections to the military from career. He pointed out that Papa John Phillips, who wrote the song, the hippie song, San Francisco, which was a beautiful song, by the way, very beautiful song. But he went to Annapolis. His wife worked in the Pentagon. His sister went into the Pentagon. Um, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, right? Crosby and Stills for career military families, and the band America. Every member was from a career military family that grew up in military bases, and all those groups tied to either CIA or the military, which is quite a revelation because it's the exact opposite of what everybody would have thought. But I'll give you a personal account. I was a hippie back then, and we had a hippie paper in Boston. We're talking around 1970, 71, called the Boston Phoenix. And it's where you would get all the left-wing news, the latest stuff on the dope paraphernalia and the latest stuff about rock, hippie rock bands. And eventually that newspaper merged with another newspaper called Boston After Dark, which was more commercial. And the left-wingers on the editorial staff of the Phoenix were outraged, and they formed their own newspaper called The Real Paper. And they want everyone to know this is the real hippie newspaper. And, I hawked these newspapers on the street for a brief period of time as a hippie myself. Now, here's the thing. Here's the deal, okay? The publisher and owner of The Real Paper, you know what his name was?
Rockefeller?
David Rockefeller Jr., that's right. So naturally, our assumption would be that he was rebelling against his father's conservative politics. But no, the other thing that Dave McGowan made, the observation he made that was so fascinating, was that Vito Polikas, who was apparently the prototype of the whole hippie movement, he was a guy, Wikipedia says he's the guy who coined the phrase freak out. He brought these topless dancers to the Sunset Strip, and he was the original hippie. He was an in-law of the Rockefellers. His uncle was the father of Winthrop Rockefeller's wife, Winthrop Rockefeller being the brother of David Rockefeller. So here you've got all these connections between the Rockefellers and the hippie movement, and this is backed up by a quote that I'll give you from my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, from somebody else. This is from James Coonan, from his book published in 1968, The Strawberry Statement, Notes of a College Revolutionary. He's describing the 1968 annual meeting of SDS. That was the big student anti-war revolutionary group, right? He said, quote, also at the convention, men from business international roundtables tried to buy up a few radicals. These men are the world's leading industrialists, and they convened to decide how our lives are going to go. They're the left wing of the ruling class. They offered to finance our demonstrations in Chicago. We're also offered Esso Rockefeller money. They want us to make a lot of radical commotion so they can look more in the center as they move to the left, unquote, James Coonan. So it all ties together, and it all fits. It was a psyop in the 60s.
It's like Days of Rage, brought to you by General Electric. That's something else. In that interview, Jan Irvin also points out that the Grateful Dead were bankrolled by an heiress to the Mellon banking family.
Yeah, I got that far in it. More fascinating information. Yeah. It's really great, and it really helps to clarify what was going on, because that was a huge, that was a tremendous sea change from America. We went from Leave It to Beaver to the Rolling Stones. It was a very quick transition in the 60s, the type of cultural change, and that doesn't happen just spontaneously. That was definitely financed and rigged by the powers that be.
That's what Michael Hoffman writes about in his book Psychological Warfare, and I forget the name of the book. It's about psychological warfare. It's about the Kennedy assassination. He comments how the inflection point really was the death of Kennedy, because then right after that you get the British invasion with the Beatles, and within a few years, kind of like the style of the early 60s, very, very much like the 50s, had given it into the whole hippie scene. And he thought the trauma of Kennedy served as sort of it's a ritual, and it was done in such a ritualistic fashion for a reason, and that was kind of the kickoff point for the 60s. Another point, I just had these notes next to me that happened from a previous interview I was going to use, but it's relevant for here, regarding controlled opposition. A guy named Sherman Skolnick, he's a researcher out of Chicago, and he went into the background of some of the high-profile leaders of the counterculture movement. And he found that Jerry Rubin, Abbie Hoffman, Tom Hayden, had been funded by the establishment for all their antics, by the Carnegie Foundation, and also government from the Office of Economic Opportunity. And William Kunstler, he was a former OSS agent. And all these guys are fun. Black Panther got money from the Ford Foundation. And again, a lot of people have said that just because these foundations were taken over by leftists and they were violating the wishes of their fathers, but what it really was these groups knew that the best way to control the opposition is to be the opposition. I think Lenin said that, and Lenin turns out Lenin was controlled opposition. So here, that's the 20th. This is our century, isn't it? So.
Yeah, there aren't too many accidents within the realm of that century.
Yeah, I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt said that there are no coincidences in politics. I guess he would know. Well, listen, I've had you for a little past the time I said I'd have you, and so I don't want to take up any more of your evening. I want to thank you for coming on tonight and sharing your experiences, your thoughts, and your book and your movie. It's it's Shadowring, product of Free Mind Films, and they're at freemindfilms.com. And you can order the DVD now, correct?
Yes, you can order the DVD from them, and we'll have an instant video download hopefully soon.
And you can buy that too.
But right now at freemindfilms.com, you can order the hard copy DVD. That's what we have at the moment, but we'll get the instant video soon. And of course, my book is Truth is a Lonely Warrior, that goes beyond the film. Because, again, we can only do so much in a 2-hour movie. The book was a movie that would take 8 hours, but there's a lot more data in there. And I go into chemtrails and vaccines. I try to really make the book a primer that you can give someone who's never heard this stuff or only glancingly heard of it. And hopefully, with the documentation that's there and enough of the broad picture, help bring a person closer to reality, what's going on in our world.
And that book, when I got it, it was only ebook. Is it a physical copy now?
Oh yes, very much so. Within a few months of the ebook, I did make it into a paperback. So yes, the paperback can be bought at Amazon.com. And
of course, your website is jamesperloff.com.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Correct. Well, listen, James, thanks for coming on tonight. I think sometime in the future, if you'll come back, I'll invite you back. We'll talk more about this because this stuff really goes deep, and we can talk for hours upon hours about this stuff. So, but I want to thank you for coming on tonight. It was a great show.
Thank you for having me on, and you're a great host, and it's very clear that you're very well informed on the issues, and we need more people like you.
Oh, thank you.
I will make the whole planet well informed, and because what we really want is to make a better world. It's been under the control of this shadow oligarchy for far too long, making our life miserable with wars and a depressed economy and poisoning our food and so many other things that we want to get rid of. So let's keep up the fight, and thanks so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.